Good day. A warm welcome to all our attendees today from across the globe. Thank you all for joining us today for this webinar that will share the best practices of user experience design for your iPad applications. This webinar is hosted by Impetus Technologies. I am Sheila, your moderator for this session, and joining me as a presenter is Lee Chapman, one of our user experience designers. This webinar is divided into two sections. The first section, we will discuss some key issues that will help you decide if creating an iPad-specific app makes sense for you and what kind of effort is involved. In the second session, we will focus on some iPad-specific design issues that help you create a great user experience for your customers. I welcome you to what we hope to be an interesting session.
Thank you, Sheila. I just want to make one more point before we start. I'm going to show examples of different applications. This work has not been completed by Impetus. They are for illustration only to identify key points. So, to get started, the first thing that we have to consider is what's the problem. We want to know, why should we support the iPad? How do we go about supporting the iPad? And it's going to cost more to develop for the iPad. Is it really worth it? So the first thing is to identify what's different. Well, obviously, the screen size. There are some additional UI elements. Users' expectations are different. And there's also the potential for a difference in our revenue model. So when you consider additional screen size and additional UI elements, that raises your expectations. So obviously the screen size, when we look at the Retina display, it's 4 times the area of your iPhone. And the additional UI elements are the popovers and split views. So popover is just a transient view that is revealed when the person taps the control. And the split view is a full screen view that divides the screen into a left navigation and a right content area. Both of these are very common on the iPad, and your customers are going to be used to them. When we talk about our customers' expectations, the key thing is that they're looking for a sense of more. They want an application, not a website. So we have to be sensitive to that and create an application that's engaging. And revenue brings up an interesting point. iPad apps tend to support a significantly higher price than iPhone apps. So there's an opportunity to look at your business model around developing for the iPad. So we have 3 options. You can rely on Compatibility Mode, you can create a universal app, or you can create a version of your app specifically for the iPad. And I'm going to look at each one of these in turn. The compatibility mode is the simplest. The iPhone app that you created now will run on your iPad. The iPhone app that you have already written will run on your iPad. No additional development effort. And for some applications, this might be a reasonable choice. For example, the calculator app, or an app of that simplicity, there is nothing that we'd want to do to enhance that app for a larger screen. And if users want to run this in the 2x mode in compatibility, that's fine too. So the first step is understanding your customers and your business model and what problems and tasks you're solving for them, and understand, do you even need to create an iPad-specific version? And if you've decided that you do want an iPad-specific version, the next step would be to decide if you want to create a universal app. And that is an application that is a single download from the iTunes App Store that can run on an iPhone or an iPad. It's the same product. The key points around here, though, is simply scaling your app works, but it doesn't necessarily create the best results. And you really should take advantage of the additional screen space. We'll look at an example of this later. Another issue about designing for the iPad is that, for the iPhone, if you use Apple's standard UI elements, you can really create a great looking app without a lot of effort. It's very, very straightforward. For the iPad, it's much, much harder to create a really compelling visual experience. And if we look at creating an iPad-specific app, key things to remember are that iPad apps aren't just oversized iPhone apps. However, it's not all bad news because the development effort may not be significantly more. The investment you've made in your business logic, the real value add to your application is preserved. However, if you do create a separate iPad version, it's important to make users feel they're choosing that they are not choosing between two different apps like a light version and a pro version. You want it to be solving the same problem, just a richer user experience. And of course, with every business decision, we want to know how costs are affected. We've talked about a higher price per unit, but for example, if you're a game developer, it could be twice as much to develop for the iPad because of the larger graphics. If you're doing a productivity app, maybe the multiplier is something like 1.2. It all depends on what your application does. And again, the single biggest element of your development cost, the engineering of the business logic, remains constant. So I'm raising a lot of questions and not providing a lot of answers, but it's very specific to your individual business situation. We're going to go next to a poll. Sheila?
Yeah. We are going to be running a poll, and we've kind of categorized into 4 different categories. What is the most difficult challenge you face in developing for the iPad? We have 4 options: design, engineering staffing, QA testing, and cost.
So we're going to wait now to see the results of the poll. Just a moment while we wait for the results.
Okay, the results are coming in. It looks like 50% of them think it's design is the biggest hurdle.
Well, that really makes sense because, as I said, it's easier to create a great user experience for the iPhone. The iPad with the larger screen real estate, the design is more complicated. To make it richer, it takes more work. And it's an area that's very competitive. That's how we're selling our applications. And I'm not surprised that people are finding that the most difficult point. So this makes sense. And certainly, looking at other people's applications, developing your own design skills is, something we should be doing. So, thank you for running the poll, Sheila.
Thank you.
From here, we're going to get a little technical, and from this point on, I'm going to be talking about design-specific issues. So initially, briefly, I just wanted to cover some of the business case that you might have to come up with for why you should invest in an iPad version. But now we're going to talk about specifically designing your app. The first thing is keep focus. Remember the laser focus you brought to your iPhone app to do one task well? The large iPad screen isn't an invitation to bring back all functionality you might have pruned from your iPhone application. So we want to innovative way to do a clear task. We don't want to just add features because we have more screen real estate. And as I just said, we don't want to bring back additional functionality. And I'm going to give you some guidelines that, in practice, Apple gave us a lot of direction when they released the iPad. And let's look at some of those guidelines and figure out which ones have worked really well and which ones haven't worked so well. So you need to make it work seamlessly in either mode. And when I say mode, I mean in landscape or portrait. People pick up their iPad and they grab it from any angle. Unlike the iPhone, where you had the speaker at the bottom, the earpiece at the top, and there was only really one natural orientation to pick it up. For the iPad, you can just grab it in any direction. And we want to minimize the full frame sweeps. When you develop for the iPhone, often you're creating lists. For example, the contact list, you tap someone's name, the whole screen changes over to show the personal contact information. That's okay because we're on very tight screen real estate, but for the iPad with a larger screen, that would be jarring to the user. So we want to minimize that whole complete redraw of the screen whenever possible. And navigation should really be reduced to a sidebar or a popover, and we'll look at some examples. Now, the biggest guideline that does not work, though, is making apps look like physical objects. And that's called skeuomorphic design. It's hard to say, it's hard to do, and it's really hard to measure the results. And we'll take a look at some examples of this. Here's Apple's Notes app, and the application makes some promises to the user that it doesn't keep. You know, for example, we have on the right-hand side, we look at the Notes view, and we have this paper. Well, we know from applications like iBooks that are the Maps app that we can turn pages. But in this case, the pages don't turn. We've got these left and right arrows at the bottom of the view. And we have this plus sign to add a new page and so on. And the content area scrolls. All of these things are confusing because it makes this promise that this will work like a physical object, but at different points it breaks. It's just not clear what parts of the interface is supposed to function like an application and which is supposed to be like a real notebook. And we'll look at this problem again throughout the rest of the examples. But another guideline I'd like to suggest is no tab bars. So we used to have tab bars at the bottom of our iPhone. Well, we still have tab bars at the bottom of our iPhone app, but moving those to the iPad doesn't feel quite as right. The task-driven get-in-get-out mentality of the iPhone, the tabs aren't needed. We're more relaxed on the iPad. Navigation can be more, can be simpler and not have to be so in your face at all times. And the other practical problem is that these tab bar buttons, they can be hard to reach, you know, because you have to use your other hand and you're usually holding the iPad with one hand. So there are some really good alternatives, however, to tab bars if you're refactoring your application. And we'll look at some of those examples. So Flipboard, if you look at the top right corner, you'll see there's that red ribbon. Tapping that red ribbon causes a whole host of navigation items to slide out. They're there when you need them, there's convenient access, but then they slide away when you don't. So much better than if they had had tabs for each of the news, business, tech and science, and so on areas at the bottom of the screen. Another example is USA Today. Now, their tabs have been driven by content. If you look at the top left corner of the screen, you see above the USA Today logo, there's an area called Sections. And if I tap that area, I get essentially a HUD view of the different sections of the USA Today application. This is a great way to show navigation and give it focus when it needs it and sort of have it move to the background when not necessary. So if I tap Tech, it would just switch me to that section. Another question that people have about designing for the iPad is scrolling or paging. So scrolling is clearly easier than swiping from page to page. On the other hand, depending on your data, there are people that believe paging is easier than scrolling. The problem is that there's no clear answer for all applications. You have to know your data, you have to know your users, you have to do usability testing. The only thing I would suggest as a guideline is that if you are doing scrolling, make sure that it's clear to the user that you are scrolling up and down and that there's some affordance that content doesn't neatly clip at the bottom of the screen and you don't realize that there's more that can come up into the view. And the other thing is that the iPad scrolls smoother than any other computer out there. So as we're talking about scrolling, we can talk about gestures. And remember that we're often holding the device with one hand. So, we want to be careful about what kind of gestures if we need two hands to pinch or zoom. And if you do create non-standard gestures, you want to make sure that you teach the users through onboarding and first-time walkthroughs, through tutorials, make sure that the user has an easy way to learn the gestures. And you have to remember also that there are several iOS level gestures that you have to take into account, including in iOS 5, additional gestures were introduced that the user can turn on for things like switching from app to app or closing an app that use 4 and 5 fingers. So be thoughtful. You don't always have to use the split view. As we saw, the major shortcoming of the split view, and we'll show you some examples in a moment, is it creates a busy and on-focus screen. When you think about the settings app, it's fine because you see all of your settings. You select a setting on the left-hand side. The application changes the right-hand side. You change your settings, and you're back out, and you're on to your next task. You don't spend a lot of time working there. On the other hand, in the Mail app, the problem is that every email message needs to be responded to, filed, or deleted in a way, so there's this constant back and forth between the two sides. And when you come to the application, it's not clear which one really should have your focus. So there are other ways. We looked at the USA Today example, and here's an example called IA Writer by Information Architects. It's a beautiful application for writing. And instead of using the split view, they use the Popover View, as you see here, shown on the left-hand side, to allow people to move from document to document, because they realized the amount of time you spend writing in the document is the majority of time you use working with the app. So you didn't need this instant access to all the other documents that you had in your library. Great application, very elegantly designed. Being creative, let's look at some other apps. Paper, instead of having a modal toolbar, they have this toolbar where you just, with a gesture, bring it up from the bottom, and it's beautifully rendered. In this case, the skeuomorphic design, the design that references physical items makes sense because it sets my expectation. I know when I pick up that pencil what kind of line I'll be able to draw with it versus the fountain pen or the paintbrush. In this case, echoing that real world turned out to be a really effective design decision. We'll look now at Tops, their pendant app, beautiful app for looking at baseball statistics. And their navigation, they're using a cover flow type effect. And you notice that within the application, the corners of the whole screen are rounded, and on each baseball card, as it were, the corners are rounded of the content view, just like old-fashioned baseball cards. And there's a rich texture to the background. They didn't just use a solid fill, and they didn't default to Apple's linen texture either. So it's a beautifully created application. Okay. If I go further into that app, I can see statistics, and I can choose different ways of viewing the statistics. So just to collecting our thoughts, we want to minimize the input and maximize the output, of course. And with limited screen real estate and the limit on physical actions to complete one task, we don't want to swipe and touch too often. It pushes you to create dead simple information architecture to use a minimum number of actions. So this goes hand in hand with the fundamental law of user interaction design, the minimal input, maximum output. Since the smallest touch point for each operation is a circle the size of a fingertip, you don't want to cram features or ads into this tight frame. We have to focus on the essential elements. And we don't want to waste our screen real estate and user attention on secondary functions. The other thing is that, the information architecture work that you do here in simplifying and creating focus in your app, this is actually a great launching point to use that same architecture with a few tweaks to create a great web-based experience on the laptop as well. There's a few other things I'd like to talk about, and that's artwork. That includes artwork. As mentioned before, users expect high-fidelity artwork in the apps, so you're going to want to go back and look at your artwork and make sure that, for example, metal textures are clear and that there's a richness to things. Things aren't blurry because they're larger screened, on the larger screen, the larger the screen. As you know, there's a launch image called default.png, and there's a few little catches about developing it for the iPad. From your experience, you know that for the iPhone and the iPod Touch, you have to include the status bar region. But for the iPad, it doesn't include the status bar. And you need to create two default.png versions, one for the portrait orientation and one for landscape. And of course, you can go to the Apple Developer Connection to learn more about the dimensions for these. Another point of artwork is that, well, I'm sure you're supporting Retina displays by now. So the good news is that you've already created several of the icons you'll need for the iPad. If you look at this table, the items I've outlined in red are the only new pieces of artwork you would need to create as a minimum to create an iPad app. So one last thing to think about while we're talking about this issue of creating artwork is the payload size, or the size of your app. So Apple's told us the apps can be up to 2 gigabytes. That's great, so lots of space. But we want to minimize the file size, and if it's at all possible, we really want to be under the 50 megabyte limit for over-the-air downloads. What that does for the user experience is enormous. It means that your customer can see your app, perhaps referenced in an article on the internet, go to the App Store on the device, select it, download it, and use it right now, and pay for it right now. Versus, if it's greater than 50 megabytes, they have to log into iTunes and search for it in the iTunes Store, download it to their desktop system, and then sync their device. And that really puts you at a disadvantage. So there are different options. If there is information that you can download after install, for example, additional multimedia content, that might be one way to make your over-the-air download under 50 megabytes. And one last tip for your engineers is that if you're developing a universal app, they might want to consider defining separate ViewController classes for the iPhone and the iPad. If there's a significant amount of shared code, you can always put the shared code in a base class and then implement custom subclasses to address device-specific issues. So these are some general guidelines, and I'm going to go and review them against some real-life examples. And the first place we'll look is iPad Mail. So you see the application here. And let's compare it with the iPad on the phone. So for the phone, it's on the go. And on the iPad, as I said, it's more relaxed and encourages more in-depth use. It's efficient enough for people to use on the go, but it's kind of a sit down and do thoughtful replies. And it provides a lot more on-screen space for people's messages. There's some meaningful touches of realism, and it makes it easier to organize and edit your mail. And the visual stability of a single uncluttered screen provides users everything they need in one place with minimal context changes. So using it on the iPhone, the compromise is that you're constantly changing what your screen view. On the iPad, things stay stable. However, people coming from the iPhone to the iPad can easily recognize toolbar items and mailbox structure and immediately know how to use them because they're virtually identical. So Apple didn't create two competing applications. They took one task and made a richer experience around using it on the iPad. And that's what you're going to want to do with your app. So we're going to look at some of the important changes they made. People can use the app in any of 4 orientations. Most of the screen is reserved for the current message. There's a flatter hierarchy, and we know that customers have trouble understanding hierarchy. And we drastically reduced the full screen transitions. And in iPad Mail, there's a small amount of skeuomorphism, or this realistic effect, that I think actually does work well. When I go to delete messages, as I select them, they create a casual pile on the right-hand side, each one moving on top of the other, offset by a little bit. That sloppiness actually creates a bit of a smile, and it also clearly communicates, here are the messages you're going to act on, and you can move them, delete them, and so on. It's actually a beautiful effect. So let's take a look at another case study, and this is for iBooks. This is looking at a book on the iPad, pretty straightforward, and pardon me, on the iPhone. And this is looking at the same book on the iPad, so you get a lot more content. But if you look carefully at, pardon me, let me go back one slide. If you look carefully at this image, you can see that Apple has tried to create a rich environment for the text. There's a binding on the left-hand side. You can see that it's obviously a hardcover book back. There is a stack of pages on the right-hand side. The binding, the pages, the shadows, the cover of the book all communicate you're reading a hardcover book. The problem is it makes a promise that it doesn't keep. If you look at the stack of pages on the right-hand side, it's not tied into the number of remaining pages left in your title. And from the physical world, we're used to looking at a book and flipping through and seeing how many pages do I have left before I'm finished. We have expectations set by the physicality of a book. When they brought it to the iPad, they implied that, they promised that, and then they didn't deliver. And the reaction to this has been strong enough that in a subsequent release to iBooks, they had to create this full screen option. And when I turn on the full screen option, as you see here, you'll notice that the binding, the book, the page lists on the side, all of that material was dropped. It's unfortunate that they didn't make a choice to make the page height representative of where you are in the book, because it could have been a beautiful effect. Another example is Google Translate. So let's take a look at Google Translate on the iPhone. Very clear tab bar. It's a simple, laser-focused app that helps me solve one problem. And it works great. I put in text. The text response of what I don't know is so much larger and easier to read. It makes it easy for me to type something in and hand it to someone. Great application. And it's a universal app. So when they moved it to the iPad, this is the user experience I'm faced with. And it's still doing everything, but you can see that it would be a lot harder, to use my hands to reach that tab bar with a few tabs floating in the middle. And my message is sort of pushed up at the very top of the screen. It's not a great use of the screen real estate. And the sad part is that if you look at the website version of Google Translate, there is a richness of data that they could have incorporated. Any word that's translated, you can tap on and see alternative translations or translation notes for. And if they had brought that into the iPad version, it would have achieved the focus of saying, yep, completely on target, we're doing the same task, but we're doing it more richly on the iPad. And I would have been able to see changes in tenses. I would have been able to have more confidence in what the quality of the translation was, or that I was getting to the right answer. So it's an opportunity that hopefully Google will take advantage of in the future. So in summary, there's just a few major takeaways. You don't want to just make your iPhone app bigger. You do want to leverage your investment in iPhone development. And you want to create a richer user experience. Remember, people are spending more time with the iPad. They're spending more time with your app on the iPad. And you do want to create greater customer engagement. So that's, in general, what I wanted to present today. Sheila is going to tell us a little bit more about Impetus, and then we'll have some questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Lee, for a great information session today. We have started receiving some questions from the audience. I would like to remind you that you may use the chat panel to ask your questions. But before I take up the audience queries, I would like to introduce Impetus Technologies to you. We are strategic partners for software product and technology-enabled companies. We are thought leaders in cutting-edge technologies, provide mature processes and practices that are methodical yet flexible. And lastly, we have diverse domain expertise. So coming back to the questions, looks like we have had questions coming in already. The first question, Lee, can you show some examples of popovers, etc. terminology?
Okay, well, it's a little hard in this presentation for me to go back, but we saw an example of a popover in the Information Architect's writing application. You can also see a popover if you have an iPad. If you go into portrait mode, so the long side up, in the Mail app and tap on the mailboxes icon at the top left, you'll see a popover.
Okay. Second question we have for this notebook, will we require a full swipe to simulate a real notebook? So,
if I understand the question properly, you're saying for the note, when you say notebook, I think you're referring to the Notes app that we reviewed in the presentation. I don't know that it necessarily would be a full page swipe, but it could be. It could be, think about the physical device. You could, instead of sweeping from side to side as we turn the pages of a book, you could sweep toward the top, and it could create the illusion that the page is wrapping around the binding and is behind you, and you can flip that page down again. So it's just an opportunity to try modeling it and seeing if the experience feels right for you and your customers.
All right, we have another question here. How does creating a universal app affect the app approval process?
So I think you're referring to the practice of once we create our apps, we submit them to the iTunes Store for approval. And if I create a universal app, does this cause it to have to be approved twice as an iPhone app or an iPad? And in fact, it's just one approval, and it does not seem to materially affect how long it takes to have your app approved. And these days, app approvals are coming through much more quickly than they had in the past. So iPhone app, iPad app, or universal app, they all seem to take about the same amount of time, depending on the complexity of the app, of course, for approval in the iTunes Store. So one of the questions is, how do I ensure that my app is under 50 megabytes? There is, for example, I apologize, I can't remember the name, but Al Gore was involved with a project where they created a book that you could download that was under 50 megabytes, but it actually had something like 400 megabytes of content. So what happened was they created an app that downloaded the book structure and table of contents and so on, and then when you were ready to read, it downloaded the rest of the content. Lufthansa has a monthly magazine. Their in-flight magazine is available for download, and you download the viewer, and the magazine comes into that 1 month at a time.
Okay. You have given a lot of stress on navigation. Is navigation that importantly?
It is. You want people to feel very secure that they're driving the experience, especially on what is essentially a very personal device. You don't want the application doing things because it's ready. You want it to do it on the user's time, much more so than even on the desktop. And you don't know what's happening around the user. They could be sitting at a busy coffee shop and have many distractions, or they could be, in bed at home at night and have no distractions at all. You have to sort of be ready and clear about what the navigation should be, no matter what's going on around the user and what their intent is.
Okay. All right. What do you think is the best approach to UX, UI testing for the iPad?
Well, those are actually two separate problems. The user experience testing, there's lots of methods. Even paper prototyping, mocking up, doing HTML mockups, all of the techniques that we use when we're doing usability testing for websites or desktop apps are just as applicable. Now remember that we do have a bit of a gotcha when developing for any iOS device, because as developers we're limited to 100 test devices. So we can't just open it up to a huge body of testers, and have a public beta. That's just not practical with iOS. But the other techniques that we've used, click-throughs and so on, all of those work for testing the strength of your user experience. I can't speak for myself to the QA type testing, because I just don't have the experience to talk about that. But we can certainly get back in touch with the person that asked that question and come up with some suggestions based on other experts in our company.
Okay. All right. The other question that's coming in is, why are the ribbon buttons better than the tab bars for one-hand operation? Could you elaborate a little bit more on this, please?
So they tend to be, rather than at the bottom, they tend to be at the side, which is closer to where your hand is holding the device. I understand you're saying, what's the difference? One's on the bottom, one's on the side. They're the same mechanism. But there's a less jarring transition to have something slide out than the tab, which is a complete swapping in of a new view. It just feels better to say, okay, bring this little area out, let me do something and slide away, than change my whole world.
Okay. All right. So, okay, the other question that's just coming up is, while developing an iPad application, what is the most important factor for an enterprise application? That's a question that just come in.
I apologize, but I would have to talk to the person that asked that question. I need a little bit more information. I'm not quite sure what they're looking for. Designing for business to business versus business to consumer, there's different issues.
Okay.
But I think the ubiquity of the iPad in business, it's becoming much, much more common. People are actually expecting a higher level of ease of use, even in business-to-business type applications, than they had in the past. I think the iPad is bringing that into the workplace, and you should try and create a user experience that is friendlier than you might have, prior to the iPad.
Okay. We have another question that's just coming in is, what do we choose, consistency in UX or exploit the hardware features? I think what they're looking for is screen size, etc., at the cost of consistency when designing for iPhone and iPad, or does it matter, or any other device for that matter?
I would tend to go toward, if I can create an amazing app for the iPad, I would do that at the expense of creating consistency with an iPhone version. I look at some of the full screen apps that we've seen, that I've shown today, such as Paper for the note-taking and drawing. Beautiful presentation, and scaling that down or scaling it to an iPhone just wouldn't feel the same way. So rather than have one app compromised by the constraints of the iPhone, depending on, this is all depending on what the task of the app is, I would actually say having two different apps. And remember that you can probably get a higher price for that separate iPad app.
Okay. All right. Another quick question is it a good idea to develop a single universal app for iPad, iPhone with different view controllers, or different apps for iPhone and iPad?
It's been my experience in the apps I've worked on that creating a different view controller but a universal app is the best situation, because you have, from a QA point of view, all of your logic gets exercised. You only have to go through that once because it's a universal app, and you're working on the presentation layer, the view, and that's 2 times the QA effort. But your model, has stayed the same, and your controller just has to be modified.
Okay, great. Thank you all for, the great questions that you've been coming up, but this is all the time that we have had to answer the questions live. We would be addressing the remaining questions that we have received through email. I would like to thank our audience again for their time. We hope that this discussion was a learning experience for you and will add value to your mobility initiatives. Just a gentle reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be available on our website's archive section by early next week. If you have any other questions, queries regarding the webinar, please feel free to email us at inquiry@impetus.com and visit our website at www.impetus.com. Thank you so much and have a great day.